There's a specific request an avoidant will almost never say out loud, one they may not even be able to name clearly to themselves, that sits quietly underneath almost every rejection they've ever delivered. It isn't a request for space, though that gets said often enough. It isn't a request to be left alone, though that gets said too. It's something considerably more self-serving than either of those things, and considerably harder for most people to recognize until it's named directly. After rejecting someone, what an avoidant actually wants, more than almost anything else, is to still be thought of as a good person by the very person they just hurt. This isn't a request anyone actually owes them, and this exploration isn't going to suggest otherwise. But understanding this specific quiet want explains an enormous amount of otherwise confusing avoidant behavior following a rejection, why they so often frame the ending in vague, blameless language, why they seem so uncomfortable with anger directed at them, why they sometimes reach out afterward not to reconcile, but simply to check whether they're still being remembered kindly. All of it traces back to this same underlying need, one that deserves to be understood clearly, precisely so it can be recognized for what it is rather than mistaken for something it isn't. Anyone listening who has been rejected by an avoidant and noticed in the aftermath a strange, persistent pressure to remain understanding, to avoid anger, to keep the story generous and blameless, even while genuinely hurting, deserves to understand exactly where that pressure originates and why extending it isn't actually an obligation, no matter how badly it might be wanted on the other side. It's worth naming before going further why this particular want deserves such careful, dedicated examination rather than being treated as a minor footnote within the broader landscape of avoidant behavior following a relationship's ending. Most conversations about processing a rejection focus primarily on the rejected person's own grief, their own path toward healing and moving forward. This exploration approaches the topic from a different, somewhat unusual angle, examining what the avoidant actually wants from the rejected person specifically, because that specific want, once understood clearly, tends to explain a considerable amount of confusing pressure many people experience without ever being able to name its actual source. To understand why this specific want operates so powerfully within avoidant psychology, it helps to examine what rejection actually costs an avoidant internally, beyond whatever relief they might also feel at having created the distance they were seeking. Ending a relationship, even one an avoidant genuinely wanted to end, tends to activate a considerable amount of guilt and self-doubt, particularly for avoidants who, despite their defensive patterns, often retain a reasonably clear awareness of how their own inconsistency and unavailability contributed to the relationship's difficulties. This awareness doesn't always get expressed directly, and it certainly doesn't always get communicated to the person being rejected, but it frequently exists, quietly, underneath the more composed, decisive exterior an avoidant typically presents when ending things. This guilt creates a genuine problem for someone whose entire psychological structure is organized around avoiding difficult, exposing emotional experiences. Guilt, left unaddressed, threatens to undermine the very self-concept that makes an avoidant's usual defensive patterns feel sustainable, the belief that their choices, however difficult for others, are ultimately reasonable, necessary, and not evidence of any deeper flaw or failure on their part. Without some way of managing this guilt, an avoidant risks confronting exactly the kind of uncomfortable self-examination their defenses have always been designed to prevent. This is where the want being described throughout this exploration actually originates. If the person being rejected continues to view the avoidant favorably, continues to extend understanding rather than anger, continues to frame the relationship's ending in gentle, blameless terms, rather than holding the avoidant accountable for specific behaviors and their specific impact, this external validation offers the avoidant a powerful, if entirely unearned, form of relief from their own internal guilt. It's worth naming why this particular form of relief feels so much more accessible and so much more appealing to an avoidant than the alternative, genuinely doing the internal work required to earn a clear conscience honestly. Genuine internal work, confronting one's own patterns directly, tolerating the discomfort of honest self-examination, takes considerable time, considerable discomfort, and no guarantee of success. Securing continued favourable regard from someone already inclined toward generosity and understanding, by contrast, can happen almost immediately, simply by maintaining a sympathetic, blameless framing and hoping the other person continues extending the same kindness they've likely extended throughout the entire relationship's history. Given this stark difference in required effort, it makes considerable sense why so many avoidants gravitate towards seeking this external validation, rather than undertaking the more demanding internal alternative, even though only the more demanding alternative actually produces the kind of lasting resolution, genuine peace of mind would actually require. It allows them to continue believing their own preferred narrative, that they did what they needed to do, that they're still fundamentally a decent, reasonable person, without ever having to do the more difficult internal work required to actually verify whether that belief holds up under honest scrutiny. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has caused some genuine, if unintentional, damage to a shared space, and who desperately wants to believe that damage wasn't really their fault, or wasn't really that significant. If everyone else who witnessed the damage continues acting as though nothing happened, offering reassurance rather than acknowledgement, this response makes it considerably easier for that person to continue believing their own preferred version of events. If instead someone names the damage clearly and holds them accountable for it, that comforting preferred narrative becomes considerably harder to sustain. This is close to what an avoidant is hoping for from the person they've just rejected. Continued reassurance rather than honest acknowledgement, precisely because reassurance protects their preferred self-narrative, while honest acknowledgement threatens it directly. It's worth naming specifically what this want tends to look like in practice, because it manifests through several recognizable behaviors and expectations that become considerably easier to identify once the underlying mechanism is understood clearly. It often shows up as a preference for vague, mutual-sounding language when describing why the relationship ended, phrases suggesting things simply weren't working, or that timing wasn't right, rather than any specific acknowledgement of particular behaviours and their particular impact. This vague framing serves the avoidance want directly, distributing responsibility broadly enough that no clear, specific accountability ever needs to be assigned to anyone in particular. It also frequently shows up as visible discomfort in response to direct anger or direct accusation, a tendency to grow defensive, to minimize, or to retreat entirely when confronted with specific, pointed acknowledgement of how their behavior actually affected the other person. It helps to name some of the specific phrases and framings that tend to characterize this vague, blame-diffusing pattern, because recognizing them concretely makes the underlying mechanism considerably easier to identify in real time rather than only in hindsight. Common examples include framing the ending as simply a matter of bad timing, suggesting that circumstances rather than choices were primarily responsible for the relationship's difficulties. Another common framing involves describing both people as simply wanting different things, a phrase that sounds balanced and mutual but that frequently obscures a considerably more specific, one-sided pattern of inconsistency or unavailability that actually characterize the relationship's difficulties. A further common framing involves describing the relationship as having simply run its course, language that implies a natural, inevitable ending rather than acknowledging any specific choices or specific behaviours that contributed to the actual outcome. And a final common framing involves shifting focus toward the avoidant's own personal struggles or personal growth needs, suggesting that ending the relationship reflects necessary self-care or necessary personal work, framing that can sometimes be entirely genuine, but that can also function as a sophisticated way of avoiding specific acknowledgement of how the relationship actually unfolded and who bore responsibility for its specific difficulties. Recognizing these specific patterns doesn't require assuming malicious intent every time they appear, since some of this language genuinely does reflect an honest, if imprecise, attempt to describe something complicated. but noticing when this kind of vague framing consistently avoids any specific acknowledgement of particular behaviours and their particular impact, especially when directly asked about those specifics, offers useful, concrete information about whether the underlying want being described throughout this exploration is actually operating in a given situation. This discomfort isn't simply about avoiding an unpleasant interaction. It reflects the genuine threat that specific, pointed accountability poses to the preferred, blameless narrative the avoidant is hoping to maintain, both in the other person's mind and ultimately in their own. And it often shows up, sometimes considerably later, as attempts to check in on how they're being remembered, indirect inquiries through mutual acquaintances, occasional light contact that isn't really about reconciliation, so much as about confirming that the relationship's ending hasn't produced lasting anger or lasting negative judgment. This particular behaviour, as explored in other examinations of avoidant reconciliation attempts, can sometimes look similar to genuine attempts at reconnection, but it frequently serves this more specific, more self-protective function instead, gathering reassurance that the preferred narrative remains intact, rather than genuinely seeking to rebuild anything substantive. There's something important worth naming here regarding why this particular want feels so urgent and so significant to an avoidant, even though it might seem, from the outside, like a relatively minor concern compared to the more obviously significant issues already explored throughout other examinations of avoidant psychology. It's worth tracing this specific want back to its likely developmental origin, because understanding where it comes from clarifies why it operates with such consistent force across so many different avoidant individuals, rather than this pattern being some kind of unusual, isolated personality quirk. Many avoidants grew up in environments where being perceived as good, reasonable, or well-behaved carried disproportionate importance, sometimes because that perception was directly tied to receiving affection or avoiding punishment. Sometimes because open conflict or open acknowledgement of wrongdoing simply wasn't modelled or permitted within their early family environment. In either case, this early environment tends to teach a lesson that persists well into adulthood, that maintaining a favourable, blameless self-image in the eyes of others isn't simply preferable, but genuinely necessary for maintaining safety and belonging. This early lesson helps explain why the want being described throughout this exploration operates with such urgency, even in circumstances like the aftermath of an adult romantic rejection, where the original childhood stakes no longer actually apply. The nervous system continues responding as though maintaining this favourable perception remains genuinely necessary for safety, regardless of how disconnected that response has become from any actual present-day consequence. This is precisely why avoidants often pursue this particular want so instinctively and so persistently, even when, from a purely adult rational perspective, it would make considerably more sense to simply accept responsibility honestly and move forward, rather than expending so much energy managing how the rejection gets perceived and remembered by the person most directly affected by it. This origin doesn't excuse the behaviour, and it doesn't create any obligation for anyone to accommodate it simply because it traces back to genuinely difficult early experiences. But it does offer useful context for understanding why this particular pattern feels so automatic and so persistent, a deeply ingrained survival strategy operating well past the point where it actually serves any genuine, present-day purpose. This want connects directly to the same deep foundational fear already discussed elsewhere, the fear of being fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unworthy, someone whose true nature, once fully exposed, would be found genuinely unacceptable. A rejection, particularly one met with clear, specific anger and clear, specific accountability, threatens to confirm exactly this fear, suggesting that the avoidance behaviour wasn't simply a reasonable response to a difficult situation, but genuine evidence of the deeper inadequacy they've spent their entire life defending against ever having to face directly. Being remembered kindly, by contrast, offers a considerable, if ultimately hollow, form of protection against this fear. It allows the avoidant to continue believing, at least for a while longer, that whatever damage they caused wasn't really evidence of anything deeply wrong with who they are. Simply an unfortunate but understandable outcome of circumstances that don't require deeper examination. This is precisely why this want feels so significant to an avoidant, even when it might seem, from an outside perspective, like a strange thing to prioritize immediately after ending a relationship that presumably mattered enough to have been worth entering in the first place. It's worth addressing something important here, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misapplied if treated as suggesting that every instance of an avoidant seeking understanding or using gentle language following a rejection reflects this same self-protective mechanism, rather than something genuinely different and more admirable underneath. Not every avoidant expressing regret or using measured, non-blaming language is doing so purely to protect their own self-image at someone else's expense. Genuine remorse, real acknowledgement of specific harm caused, paired with real, sustained effort to understand and address the patterns that produce that harm, represents something considerably different from the self-protective want being described throughout this exploration, even though the surface behaviour, gentle language, avoidance of harsh blame, can sometimes look remarkably similar in the moment it's expressed. The clearest distinguishing factor between these two possibilities tends to involve specificity and sustained follow-through, rather than the tone or gentleness of the language itself. Genuine remorse tends to include specific acknowledgement of particular behaviours and their particular impact, rather than vague, general language distributing responsibility broadly enough that nothing specific ever gets named. It also tends to be accompanied by sustained interest in understanding what went wrong, sometimes including genuine curiosity about the other person's experience, and genuine willingness to sit with the discomfort of hearing that experience described honestly, rather than becoming defensive or retreating once specific accountability actually gets raised. The self-protective want being described throughout this exploration, by contrast, tends to prioritize the maintenance of a comfortable, blameless narrative over any genuine curiosity about specific impact, and it tends to respond to direct, specific feedback with discomfort, defensiveness, or retreat, rather than genuine engagement. Recognizing this distinction matters considerably for anyone trying to determine whether a particular avoidant's gentle, measured language following a rejection reflects genuine growth and genuine remorse, or whether it reflects the more self-serving pattern this exploration has been examining throughout. Genuine self-honesty in making this assessment matters far more than assuming automatically that gentle language always indicates one particular possibility over the other. It's worth addressing directly something that deserves careful, honest attention, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as suggesting that extending this kind of understanding and generosity toward an avoidant who has just caused genuine pain is somehow required, expected, or even simply the more mature, evolved response available. This is not what's being suggested here, and it deserves to be stated plainly and without qualification. Nobody who has been genuinely hurt by an avoidant partner's inconsistency, unavailability, or eventual rejection owes that person continued kindness, continued understanding, or a carefully preserved, blameless narrative regarding what happened between them. Anger, when it's an honest response to genuine harm, is not something requiring apology or suppression simply because understanding this underlying psychological mechanism might make that anger feel, momentarily, less necessary or less justified. It's worth expanding on this specific point directly, because anger following a rejection tends to carry a particular kind of cultural stigma, worth naming and rejecting explicitly. Anger often gets characterized, in broader conversations about breakups and emotional processing, as somehow less evolved or less healthy than calm acceptance, a framing that conveniently serves exactly the want being described throughout this exploration, since it pressures the person who was hurt to suppress precisely the response that would threaten an avoidant's preferred, blameless narrative. This cultural framing deserves to be questioned directly, rather than simply accepted as an unquestionable standard for emotional maturity. Anger, appropriately directed at genuine harm, serves several legitimate psychological functions. It helps clarify boundaries, making clear what behavior was genuinely unacceptable rather than something to simply tolerate or excuse. It mobilizes energy toward necessary changes, whether that means ending contact decisively, seeking support, or simply protecting oneself from similar patterns in future relationships. And it offers an honest, accurate emotional response to genuine mistreatment, rather than a performed, more socially palatable substitute that serves someone else's comfort at the expense of one's own authentic experience. None of this means anger needs to become someone's permanent, defining emotional state following a rejection, but its presence in the immediate aftermath, and for however long it genuinely persists, deserves respect rather than suppression, regardless of whether that suppression would make things more comfortable for the avoidant who caused it. There's something worth naming too about how anger and eventual peace aren't actually opposed to each other the way they're sometimes assumed to be. Anger that gets honestly felt and honestly processed, rather than suppressed in service of premature generosity, tends to resolve into genuine peace more reliably and more completely than anger that gets bypassed entirely in favor of immediate, performed understanding. This is worth naming because it directly contradicts the implicit assumption often built into pressure toward premature forgiveness, that skipping anger entirely represents the faster, more direct route to genuine peace. In practice, the opposite tends to be true. Anger, processed, honestly clears the way for genuine resolution. Anger bypassed prematurely tends to resurface later, often in less direct, less manageable forms, precisely because it was never actually allowed to complete its natural, necessary function in the first place. Understanding why someone wants something is never the same as being obligated to give it to them. This distinction, already emphasized throughout other examinations of avoidant psychology, deserves to be restated here with particular emphasis, because this specific topic, more than many others, tends to produce a particular kind of pressure toward premature forgiveness and premature generosity, precisely because the mechanism being described involves exactly this kind of pressure as its central feature. There's something worth exploring further because it addresses a specific, important question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far: whether extending this kind of protective, blameless understanding toward an avoidant ex-partner actually serves anyone's genuine well-being, including, somewhat counterintuitively, the avoidant themselves. The honest answer suggests it typically doesn't, at least not in any lasting, meaningful sense, even though it might feel in the moment like the kinder, more generous choice available. When an avoidant successfully receives this kind of protective narrative preservation from someone they've hurt, avoiding the discomfort of honest accountability, they're also simultaneously avoiding exactly the kind of confrontation that sometimes serves as a genuine catalyst for meaningful self-examination and eventual growth. Guilt and discomfort, uncomfortable as they clearly are, sometimes function as necessary, if unwelcome, motivators for genuine change, precisely because they create enough internal friction to eventually make continued avoidance considerably harder to sustain. Removing this friction through generous, protective understanding, however kindly intentioned, can inadvertently remove exactly the pressure that might otherwise have prompted more genuine, lasting reflection on patterns that caused real harm. This isn't offered as an argument for deliberately withholding kindness as some kind of strategic intervention designed to force an avoidant toward growth. That approach would simply represent another version of the same manipulative dynamic already cautioned against in other examinations of this topic, using one's own behavior strategically to produce a specific effect in someone else, rather than responding honestly according to one's own genuine feelings and genuine needs. It's offered instead as a simple, clarifying piece of information that extending unearned protective kindness doesn't reliably serve anyone's genuine growth, including the avoidance, which removes one more reason someone might otherwise feel obligated to extend it against their own genuine feelings and genuine needs. There's something crucial worth naming here as well, something that deserves direct, honest treatment rather than being glossed over in favour of a tidier conclusion. Choosing honesty over protective generosity doesn't require cruelty, and it doesn't require deliberately, vindictively working to damage an avoidant's reputation or self-image as some form of retribution. There's a considerable difference between simply refusing to perform understanding one doesn't genuinely feel, holding an honest, accurate account of what happened rather than a softened, blameless version designed for someone else's comfort, and actively, deliberately working to cause additional harm beyond what honest, accurate accountability naturally produces on its own. The healthiest response tends to live somewhere in this middle ground, honest rather than either artificially generous or deliberately punitive. It's worth naming what this honest middle ground actually tends to look like in practice, because abstract description alone can be difficult to translate into actual behaviour during an emotionally significant, often painful situation. It might involve simply declining to offer the vague, blameless framing an avoidant seems to be hoping for, without needing to replace that framing with anything harsher or more accusatory than what actually feels true. It might involve responding to direct questions about how the relationship's ending is being processed, with honest, specific acknowledgement of what actually happened and how it actually felt, rather than softening that honesty into something more comfortable for the avoidant to hear. And it might simply involve declining to participate in the kind of periodic reassurance seeking already described. Choosing not to respond to indirect check-ins, clearly designed to confirm continued favourable regard, without needing to respond with anger or hostility either, simply with a kind of honest, neutral distance that doesn't perform either generosity or retribution. It's worth naming, clearly, what genuine accountability from an avoidant would actually require, since contrasting it directly against the self-protective want being described throughout this exploration helps clarify exactly how different these two things genuinely are. Genuine accountability would involve the avoidant naming specific behaviours and their specific impact without waiting to be pressed into doing so, tolerating the discomfort of hearing exactly how those behaviours affected someone else without becoming defensive or retreating from the conversation. It would involve genuinely sitting with whatever anger or hurt gets expressed in response, rather than needing that anger to be softened or resolved quickly in order to remain comfortable. And it would involve sustained, demonstrated change over time, rather than a single conversation or a single expression of regret treated as sufficient resolution on its own. This standard is considerably more demanding than simply being remembered kindly. And recognising this contrast helps explain why the want being described throughout this exploration represents such a significantly lower bar than genuine accountability actually requires. Wanting to be remembered kindly costs an avoidant nothing beyond hoping for a particular outcome from someone else's internal narrative. Genuine accountability costs considerably more, requiring real vulnerability, real tolerance for discomfort, and real sustained effort over time. This gap between what's being wanted and what genuine repair would actually require is worth sitting with directly, because it reveals just how much easier it is to hope for continued favourable regard than to actually earn it through the kind of accountability that would make such regard genuinely deserved. For anyone listening who has wondered whether extending continued kindness toward an avoidant ex-partner might eventually motivate them toward this more demanding, more genuine form of accountability, there's something important worth naming honestly. Continued kindness extended without any accompanying honest feedback rarely produces this kind of motivation, precisely because it removes the discomfort that might otherwise prompt genuine reflection. If anything, as already discussed, honest acknowledgement of specific harm, even when uncomfortable to deliver and uncomfortable to receive, tends to serve this deeper, more genuine form of growth considerably better than continued protective kindness ever could on its own. There's something worth turning toward now that centres entirely on the person who was rejected, rather than on the avoidant's internal want for continued favourable regard. Because everything explored throughout this piece has necessarily focused on decoding that avoidant's internal psychology, And that focus, however clarifying, shouldn't overshadow what actually matters most for the person navigating the aftermath of this kind of rejection. Being rejected by someone, particularly someone genuinely loved, is a legitimate source of pain, deserving full, honest acknowledgement, regardless of how reasonable or how well communicated that rejection might have been. This pain doesn't need to be minimized, managed, or converted into generous understanding, simply because doing so might feel, in some vague, culturally reinforced sense, like the more mature or more evolved response available. Full, honest processing of genuine hurt, including anger where anger is an accurate reflection of what actually happened, tends to serve genuine healing considerably better than premature, performed generosity ever could, regardless of how much that generosity might be quietly wanted on the other side of the rejection. For anyone listening who has felt this specific, subtle pressure following a rejection from an avoidant partner, the pressure to remain understanding, to avoid anger, to keep the story generous and blameless, even while genuinely, legitimately hurting, there's something important worth claiming here. That pressure was never actually about what would serve genuine healing. It was about what would serve the avoidant's own need to avoid confronting their role in causing real pain. Recognizing this clearly offers permission to set that pressure down entirely, to process this experience honestly, according to one's own genuine feelings, without needing to perform a generosity that was never actually deserved or required in the first place. There's one final thought worth leaving on, because it addresses something that deserves to close this exploration honestly, rather than on a note that overstates what this understanding can actually provide. Recognizing this specific want and choosing not to fulfill it out of some misplaced sense of obligation doesn't guarantee that an avoidant ex-partner will ever confront their own patterns honestly. And it doesn't guarantee any particular outcome regarding whether they eventually undertake the genuine accountability, already described as considerably more demanding than what they actually want in the immediate aftermath of a rejection. Some avoidants do eventually confront these patterns, sometimes precisely because the absence of easy, protective reassurance from someone they hurt eventually creates enough discomfort to prompt genuine reflection.